Okay, so before we launch into a discussion of the free and direct discourse, which is a species of third-person omniscient narration that in this novel invites us to inhabit, really forces us to inhabit. I think it's better to think about it as forcing us to inhabit the interiority, the inner life, the psyche of this psychopath, this serial killer, Dick Steele. I want to spend some time situating the novel in its historical context, and namely the context of the early post-war period, the couple of years in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, which, as you all know, ends in 1945. Well, the novel comes out in 47, and we can assume that the novel is set at the very same time or around the same time in which the novel appears in publication. And so we're dealing with an American culture that is only starting to come to grips with the sort of recent memory of the violence and carnage of the Second World War. There are a couple of ways in which Dix is sort of quintessentially of the early post-war period. One has to do with his economic situation. We get a sense that this is a person who is living a very precarious life, economically speaking. He doesn't have a job. He is living sort of hand to mouth on the charity of this rich uncle of his, for whom he reserves a lot of contempt. And he is in effect homeless were it not for the kindness of this acquaintance of his, who, as Dick says, is off in South America. He has a job in South America, and so the home comes available, and so Dix is living sort of on the back of this guy that he met in a chance encounter, and is now kind of subletting his place. So there's a kind of economic precarity that is characteristic of Dix's life in the couple of years after the war, and this is in fact characteristic. This is one of the things that really kind of defines the post-war world, is this feeling that a lot of combatants, a lot of soldiers who come back from the war really felt, was this idea that like these material sacrifices and human sacrifices that the entire country and in combatants even more so make during the war, well, that would be rewarded with this emergent world of economic and social prosperity. This level the class divide, and it would allow everybody to participate and enjoy the kind of economic prosperity that was dangled in front of everybody as a sort of reward for all of the sacrifices that they would make during the war, and that is not the situation that Dix finds himself in. So there's that economic precarity that defines the post-war world that we enter when we enter into the world of this novel. But the most pressing and most lasting image that we get when we encounter Dix for the first time is this person that is struggling to reassimilate into peacetime existence due to the ways in which the violence that he has been encouraged and forced to participate in during the war. He struggles to sort of find ways of capturing that exhilaration and that power and that the risks that he was able to take in his capacity as a fighter pilot. So this is a person who is struggling to kind of like get the thing that he really loved during the war. We can think of Dix as something like a kind of adrenaline junkie who now has very little or very few opportunities to to recapture the kind of adrenaline rush that comes with flying a plane over a city and bombing it. And potentially being shot out of the sky. I think that danger and that risk-taking quality that we see Dix indulging here is something that he really wants to capture again, and something that he's kind of struggling to find and struggling to get over, and is in fact not getting over. So anyway, here is our encounter with Dix, our first encounter with Dix, So I'm going to read here from page 5. So crack open the book and follow along with me. So here is our meeting with Dix. It was good standing there on the promontory overlooking the evening sea, the fog lifting itself like gauzy veils to touch his face. There was something in it akin to flying, the sense of being lifted high above crawling earth, of being a part of the wildness of air. Something, too, of being closed within an unknown and strange world of mist and cloud and wind. He'd liked flying at night. He'd missed it after the war had crashed to a finish and dribbled to an end. It wasn't the same flying a little private crate. He'd tried it. It was like returning to the stone axe after precision tools. He had found nothing yet to take the place of flying wild. It wasn't often he could capture any part of that feeling of power and exhilaration and freedom that came with loneness in the sky. There was a touch of it here, looking down at the ocean rolling endlessly in from the horizon. Here high above the beach road with its crawling traffic, its dotting of lights. The outline of beach houses zigzagged against the sky but did not obscure the pale waste of sand, the dark, restless waters beyond. So here we're met with a guy who is looking for this thing that he had during the war but sort of no longer has. The feeling of risk-taking, the feeling of energy, the kind of violence that's coursing through his veins in the context of his life as a combatant that is still coursing through his veins, although he now doesn't have what are, in effect, state-sanctioned opportunities to indulge in and to kind of give it expression in the real world. So one of the things I think we need to kind of consider here that is this idea that I think the novel is getting at, which is that the violence that's happening, or that has just happened at the level of geopolitics, the violence that is happening at an international level, played out between individuals, sure, but in their capacity as representatives of nationalist states. Well, that violence hasn't gone anywhere, even though the war has ended. The war is over, and yet the violence that is characteristic of this world remains, right? So perhaps what we're seeing here is a kind of reflection on the ways that the violence that's happening at a kind of global level has now become individuated and domesticated, and it has come home to roost in Los Angeles, in this context of this novel, in Los Angeles in 1947. And that what we're going to see throughout this novel is a kind of playing out of the psychodrama of the kind of violence that was normalized during the Second World War. It was the sort of air that everybody breathed in between the years 1939 and 45, and that that violence hasn't gone anywhere. It's simply come home. There's a couple of things to be said about air flight and Dix's identity as a former member of the United States Air Force. There's a real romance of the sky that he alludes to here, where he talks about flying as being akin to freedom. I think that this is in some ways how the Air Force inhabits the popular imagination. This is sort of like this romantic idea that a lot of people have about the Air Force. It's also the case that the Air Force tended to be peopled by members of the middle, if not the upper class. To be a fighter pilot during the Second World War was almost certainly to be a gentleman, even more so than being involved with the Navy or the Army. Members of the Air Force tended to be members of the upper classes. And that is certainly Dix. And we sort of know this about him, or we find this out about him, when we move from the bar where Dix has ensconced himself after this sort of failed attempt at, failed predatory act that opens up the novel, where he follows this woman home, and then he just doesn't have the opportunity to follow through with what he wants to follow through with. So he's sitting in a bar and he starts thinking about his friend Brub, his war buddy, his former Air Force buddy, winds up going to the home of Brub and his new wife Sylvia, and they get to talking about the war, and we learn some things about war, and we learn some things about Dick's and his friend Brub's place within that war, that is really important to understanding this novel. So turn to page 13. This is still in the first chapter. This is where Brub and Dix and Sylvia are sitting around having beer, and they get to talking about the war. And there's a couple of things that are really crucial to our understanding of the novel that get revealed here. So I'll pick up here a few sentences from the top. Comfortable room and talk and beer, 2 men and a lovely woman. Brub said, "Why do you think I fought the war? To get back to Sylvia." "And why did you fight the war, Mr. Steele?" Sylvia's smile wasn't demure. She made it that way. "For weekend passes to London," Brub suggested. He stepped on Brub's words, answering her thoughtfully. He wanted to make an impression on her. "I've wondered about it frequently, Sylvia. Why did I or anyone else fight the war? Because we had to isn't good enough. I didn't have to when I enlisted. I think it was because it was the right thing to do, and the Air Corps was the thing to do. All of us in college were nuts about flying. I was a sophomore at Princeton when things were starting. I didn't want to be left out of any excitement." "Brub was at Berkeley," she remembered. "You're right, it was the thing to do." They were steered to safe channels, to serious discussion. Brub opened another beer for the men. Brub said, "It was the thing to do, or that was the rationalization. We're a casual generation, Dix. We don't want anyone to know we bleed if we're pricked. But self-defense is one of the few prime instincts left. Despite the cover-up, it was self-defense. And we knew it." So there's a couple of things here that I want to draw your attention to, and one is this reference to their lives as college students. Dix is a student at this Ivy League university, which is Princeton. Brub is a student, or was a student, at a similarly prestigious university in California, part of the University of California system, that is UC Berkeley. They're both, students at these very prestigious American universities, and what that suggests to us, what it reveals to us, is their class position. You're not a member of the working poor if you are studying at one of these really, prestigious and expensive American universities. So we learn that about them, that these are not members of the working poor. Even if we ever thought that about them, this is clarified to us that these are members of the middle class, if not the upper middle class, if not the lower upper class. And that is characteristic of who becomes a member of the Air Force during the war. It was the gentleman class that becomes involved with the Air Force in a way that they didn't become members of the Navy or the Army. So we learned that about these 2 men, Brub and Dix, that they're members of the middle class, if not the upper middle class. Now there's this reference to the cover-up. Despite the cover-up, it was self-defense, and we knew it. This might have been a reference that you made very little of, that you breezed by, that you didn't know sort of how to place. So I wanted to sort of zero in on it. What is this reference to the cover-up? Despite the cover-up, it was self-defense. So what is the cover-up? Well, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I know what it's referring to, and I wonder if it has to do with something like the bombing of Dresden. The bombing of Dresden, perhaps, the bombing of Hiroshima, the bombing of Nagasaki. So despite the sort of gentility and the romance of the air, the romantic vision of the Air Force pilot, the fighter pilot, participating in a kind of chivalric romance of the sky, despite their upper class carriage, the war in the sky was one that wreaked enormous carnage, devastating carnage. Those of you who have read Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five, his sort of counterfactual novel of the Second World War, know something about the bombing of Dresden. That the Allied powers, when they bomb the city of Dresden using firebombs, they in effect light the entire city ablaze, and there were enormous civilian casualties attendant upon that act of bombing the city. It wasn't like these are just locating strategic military targets. No, of course they were bombing civilians, they were bombing women and children, and devastating the city from the ground up. And there is a kind of cover-up, and in fact I would argue that there's a kind of cover-up even to this day, even though historians know a lot about the bombings of Axis cities like Dresden and like Berlin. So just anecdotally, a few years ago, some of you may remember, there was an installation at the Canadian War Museum having to do with aerial warfare, and what the installation did was quite, in lots of circles, really controversial, where installations having to do with the bombing of London during what is called the Blitz, the bombing of London by the German Luftwaffe. Well, images and documents pertaining to the Blitz were situated directly alongside images and documents pertaining to the bombing of Berlin, the bombing that was carried out by members of the Royal Air Force. And many veterans were completely up in arms about this installation, because there was this perception that there was a kind of equivocation happening, or kind of a moral, there's an implicit argument being made that these things are morally equivalent, that the bombing of London was morally akin to the bombing of Berlin and vice versa. And there was this real push on the part of veterans to eradicate that part of the installation, and say, like, we can't keep, or we can't hold the bombing of Dresden in the same sentence as we do the bombing of London. They're meaningfully different. And I suppose that is true to the extent that Germany was clearly the aggressor during the war, and I think of the Second World War as a just war. It needed to be fought to fight the spread of fascism. But at the same time, there were absolutely civilian casualties of the bombing of Berlin and the bombing of Dresden, and certainly of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hydrogen bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So perhaps what we are meant to think about is the sort of contradistinction between the gentility and the sort of middle classness, the ordinariness of Dix, but also his friend Brub, their sort of domestic nature, situated alongside of this the enormous kind of carnage that they wrought as members of the U.S. Air Force. So I think that is very much in the middle ground, if not the foreground, of this novel, the context of war and the context of violence. That both of these men, even if one of them is a serial killer and the other one is the detective, both of these men participated in violence. And I think, getting back to what I said earlier, I think that the sort of dominant argument of this novel is that the violence that was happening between the years of 1939 and 45 at the level of geopolitics has now come home to roost, and is characteristic of life in post-war America when this novel comes out, where this novel is set. Okay, I'm going to pause the video here, and I'm going to come back and pick up a discussion of free indirect discourse. Okay.